Margaret Hartwell had a habit of arriving early. Not because she was impatient, but because she liked the quiet moment before things began, the way a room felt before it filled with people, the way morning light sat still on a wooden floor before the household woke. She was the kind of woman who noticed things that other people walked past without a second thought. A bird on a garden wall. The exact shade of a sky before rain. The way a man's expression changed for just a second before he remembered to compose himself. She noticed Edmund Ashford the first time she saw him, when she was 17 years old and he was 22. He walked into her father's drawing room like he had walked into every room his entire life, as though the room had been waiting for him. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. He shook her father's hand, accepted a seat by the fire, and spoke about horses and the weather and the new road being built through the county. He did not look at Margaret even once. She thought about him for 3 weeks after that visit. Over the following years, their paths crossed the way paths cross in small English counties, at dinners, at garden parties, at church on Sunday mornings when the weather was good enough to make attendance feel less like duty. Edmund was always polite to her. He was never unkind. He simply did not see her in the way that mattered. She was Lord Hartwell's daughter. A pleasant girl. Quiet. Sensible. Exactly the sort of woman a man like Edmund greeted with a nod and then forgot about before he had crossed the room. Margaret did not forget about him. She was 23 when something briefly shifted. Edmund arrived at her family's estate for a week-long visit, invited by her father, who had known Edmund's late father well. On the second morning, Edmund asked if she would ride with him. Not with real intention, his usual companion had sent word that he would be delayed, but Margaret did not know that, and even if she had, she might have said yes anyway. They rode for 2 hours through the fields east of the estate, where the land opened into wide, flat green and the sky felt enormous above them. Edmund talked more than he usually did. He told her about a city he had visited in France and the strange small café where he had eaten the best meal of his life. He asked her what she was reading, and when she told him, he said he had read it 2 years ago, and that there was one chapter in the middle that had stayed with him ever since. She told him which chapter she thought he meant, and he looked at her with something like surprise and said, "Yes. Exactly that one." He left at the end of the week and wrote nothing. He sent no letter. When they met again at a Christmas gathering 3 months later, he greeted her pleasantly, asked after her father's health, and moved on to speak with the men gathered near the fireplace. Margaret watched him cross the room and understood, with a quiet and private sadness, that the morning ride had meant nothing to him. It had been 2 hours of pleasant company on a day when he had nothing else to do. She refilled his tea when the footman was slow that evening. He did not notice. The years that followed were ordinary on the surface. Margaret grew into her late 20s with grace and purpose. She managed her father's household after her mother passed. She read widely, spoke thoughtfully, and had a small circle of friends who valued her company. From the outside, she looked completely fine. And she was, mostly. But there was a part of her, a quiet, stubborn part she rarely examined too closely, that kept a small space reserved for Edmund Ashford. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Simply the way you might keep a chair by the window that you always intend to use but somehow never do. Edmund, during these same years, was occupied with his dukedom and his social ambitions. He managed his estates with reasonable competence. He was admired by his peers. He was considered a fine catch by every mother in the county with a daughter of suitable age, and he knew it, though he was careful not to show that he knew it too obviously. He pursued Lady Cecilia Voss for nearly a year, a beautiful, sharp-edged woman who collected the attention of wealthy men the way other people collected fine china. She was dazzling and entirely empty in the way that only becomes visible once you have been standing close for long enough. Cecilia announced her engagement to a Scottish earl on a Tuesday in November. Edmund heard the news at his club. He was not devastated by the loss of her, he was humiliated by the fact of being passed over, which is a very different thing. He arrived at the Hartwell estate 2 days later, unannounced, in a foul mood that he had dressed up as casual friendliness. Margaret received him without comment. She had tea on the table in 10 minutes. She listened to him talk about the fickleness of certain people and the general disappointments of social life for the better part of an hour. She offered him biscuits. She said the right things at the right moments. She made him feel better in the way that only a truly attentive person can, by being so steady and present that the discomfort of the world seemed smaller by comparison. He left feeling considerably improved. He did not ask how she was. He did not think to. It was a Thursday in early spring when Alistair Vane first appeared in Margaret's life. He was introduced at a small gallery opening by a mutual acquaintance, a widower of 40, with kind eyes and an unhurried manner that felt immediately different from most of the men she knew. He asked her what she thought of a painting they were both standing in front of, and then, this was the part that stayed with her, he actually waited for her answer. Not politely, the way people wait when they are preparing what they plan to say next. He listened to what she said, considered it, and then responded to the specific thing she had said, not a general version of it. She walked home that evening thinking about the conversation for entirely different reasons than she had ever thought about conversations with Edmund. Vane began to appear in the same places Margaret appeared. Not in a pursuing, overwhelming way, he was too quiet for that. He simply made it known, through small and consistent acts, that he found her company worthwhile. He remembered that she had mentioned preferring morning walks and arranged to cross paths with her at the park. He sent a book she had once said she meant to read, with a short note that said only, "I thought this might suit you." It did suit her. She read it in 3 days. Word of this, as word of everything eventually does in a county this size, reached Edmund. He felt something move in his chest when he heard it. An uncomfortable, unidentifiable thing that sat between irritation and something else he did not examine closely. He told himself it was simply the natural concern of a long-standing acquaintance. He told himself this so thoroughly that he almost believed it. Then he visited the Hartwell estate one afternoon and Margaret was out, and he waited in the drawing room for 40 minutes, and when she came home and walked through the door with cold cheeks and a particular brightness in her expression, he understood that the brightness was not about the cold air. He stayed for dinner. He looked at her, actually looked at her, for the first time in years. He noticed that she had a small scar on her left hand that he had never seen before, and he realized with a start that he did not know the story of it. He did not know what her favorite season was. He did not know what made her laugh so hard she had to stop walking. He had known this woman for more than 10 years and he knew almost nothing about her. The thought troubled him more than he expected it to. At a dinner party several weeks later, Edmund sat close enough to Margaret to watch Alistair Vane hand her a glass of wine without her asking for it, because Vane had noticed, earlier in the evening, that she favored it. It was such a small thing. A man noticing what a woman liked and acting on it without being asked. Edmund had never done that. Not once. Not for her, not for Cecilia, not for anyone. He had always assumed that the people around him would manage their own small needs, and he had been right, because the people around him always had. Margaret had always managed. She had been managing quietly for years. He left the dinner early and sat in his carriage in the dark outside and looked at nothing in particular. He began trying. Clumsily, late, but genuinely. He sent flowers, not the automatic kind that any man of his position sent out of social obligation, but her favorites, which had taken him several inquiries to identify. He wrote her a letter, careful and plain, without the usual polished formality he used when he wrote to people he wanted to impress. He asked if he might take her walking. He was honest in the letter in a way that did not come naturally to him. He said he believed he had not paid sufficient attention to her friendship over the years, and that he hoped to remedy that, if she would allow it. Margaret read the letter twice, alone in her room with the door closed. She sat with it for a long time. The part of her that had kept the chair by the window for 10 years wanted to write back immediately. But there was another part of her now, a part that Alistair Vane had quietly helped to grow simply by treating her as though her feelings were worth considering, and that part looked at Edmund's careful words and felt something careful in return. Not cold. Not angry. Simply careful, in the way of a person who has burned themselves on the same stove enough times to approach it differently. She replied after 5 days. 2 sentences. Warm, polite, and completely reserved. She said yes to the walk. They walked on a gray October morning through the park near her father's house. The trees had lost most of their leaves and the ground was soft underfoot. Edmund spoke honestly, more honestly than he had spoken to anyone in years. He told her she had always been remarkable. He told her that he had been too consumed by his own concerns to see what was right in front of him. He said he was sorry. He did not dress it up. He just said it, plainly, the way you say a thing when you are tired of not saying it. Margaret listened. She watched the path ahead. She let him finish. Then she said, quietly, Edmund. You are describing a woman who stood in every room you entered and hoped you would notice her. I do not know if that woman still exists in the same way. She paused. I think she became someone different when she finally decided that her own happiness was worth something. Edmund did not know what to say. So he said nothing. They finished the walk mostly in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, but it was a final one, the kind that closes a door gently rather than slamming it. 6 weeks later, Margaret accepted Alastair Vane's proposal. The announcement appeared in the society pages on a Tuesday morning. Edmund read it at his breakfast table. He read it once, then read it again, more slowly, as though the second reading might change what the words said. He set the paper down. He stood up. He walked to the window that looked out over his garden, which was bare and tidy in the late autumn way, and he stood there long enough for his coffee to go cold. He attended the engagement dinner, because not attending would have been noticed and commented upon, and also because he could not stay away. Margaret was wearing a pale blue dress and her hair was arranged simply, and she was the most at ease he had ever seen her, moving through the room with a lightness that he now understood had been missing for years, because she had spent years carrying something heavy that no one had helped her put down. At some point in the evening, they ended up briefly on the terrace. The music drifted out from inside. The night was cold and clear. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he should have looked at her years ago, with full attention, with recognition, with the particular grief of a man who has finally understood something too late. You deserved more, he said. From the very beginning. From me. Margaret looked at him. Her expression was kind. Not the careful, managed kindness she had shown him for years while quietly hoping he would soften. Real kindness, the kind that has come out the other side of pain and chosen not to be hard. I know that, she said. I spent a long time not knowing it. But I know it now. She touched his arm once, briefly. I hope you find what you are looking for, Edmund. I truly do. Then she went back inside, to the warm light and the music and the men who had been watching the door since she had stepped away from it. Edmund stood on the terrace alone for a while. He listened to the sound of the party from inside, the laughter, the glasses, the low hum of many people gathered in a warm room. He thought about a morning ride through wide green fields when she had said exactly the right thing about a book, and he had been surprised, and then distracted, and then moved on. He thought about the chair by the window in her father's house where she used to sit and read. He had walked past it 100 times and never thought to ask what she was reading. He thought about a letter he had received years ago, written in her careful handwriting, that he had set aside during breakfast and never answered. He went back inside eventually. He smiled at the right people. He said the right things. He was very good at that. Margaret and Alastair married in the spring, in a small church in the village where she had grown up. She wore cream, not white. She carried simple flowers. Her father wept quietly in the front pew and held a handkerchief he kept forgetting to use. Alastair held her hand during the ceremony and looked at her the way a person looks at something they intend to take great care of. Edmund sent a gift. A beautiful, leather-bound edition of her favorite book of poetry, the one she had mentioned once, years ago, in passing, not imagining for a moment that he had heard her. She opened the parcel when it arrived, saw what it was, and sat still with it in her hands for a long moment. Then she placed it on the shelf beside the other books she loved. Then she went downstairs to where her husband was waiting, and they took their afternoon walk together through the garden that was just beginning to come alive with early spring color, and she told him something funny that had happened that morning, and he laughed, and she laughed, and the sound of it floated up through the open window and out across the quiet green beyond. Edmund Ashford continued his life in the way that men like him do. His estate was well managed. His reputation remained good. He attended the right dinners and sat on the right committees and was, by every visible measure, a man of substance and standing. But there were mornings, particular kinds of mornings, gray and still, with the light sitting flat on the floorboards, when he would stand by the window of his study and feel the full, quiet weight of what he had spent 10 years not paying attention to. Not with dramatic grief. Not with the kind of feeling that collapses a person. Just a low, steady ache, the way an old injury makes itself known when the weather changes. He had been given every chance. The morning ride. The letter. The dinner where she had sat 3 seats away while he praised another woman. The evening she stood in her doorway with cold cheeks and brightness in her expression. The walk in October. Every single one of those moments had been an open door, and he had closed each one of them without ever understanding that he was doing it. The last chance had been the terrace. He had known it, standing there. He had known it was the last one. And still, she had been the one to close it, gently, without anger, with the grace of a woman who had learned the hard way that she was worth more than an open door that no one ever walked through. He never stopped respecting that. Years later, he would sometimes see them at events, Margaret and Alistair, never performing their happiness but simply living in it, the way people do when it is real. She always greeted him warmly. She was never cold, never pointed, never anything but the person she had always been. That was perhaps the hardest part. She had not changed. She had not become someone unrecognizable in her contentment. She had simply become more fully herself, as though everything she had been when she was quietly sitting in rooms he walked through without noticing had now been given room to grow. She had always been remarkable. He had just been too busy looking elsewhere to see it. He knew that now. He would know it for the rest of his life.